The diner door opens and an elderly black couple steps in, snow still on their coats. Before they reach a table, the manager snaps, "No, turn around." The old man says softly, "Sir, we just need." The manager cuts him off, louder this time. "I said no. This place isn't for people like you." Forks freeze mid-air. Everyone hears it. No one says a word. The woman lowers her head, ashamed, pulling her husband back toward the door. That's when a young black waitress steps forward and says, "If they leave, I leave too." Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from so we can bring more stories like these. Snow pressed itself against the diner windows like it wanted in. Thick flakes spun under the buzzing neon sign outside, the word "Eats" flickering on and off as if even the building was tired. Christmas Eve had thinned the streets, leaving the town quiet in that strange, lonely way that comes when most people are already home. Inside, the diner felt worn but warm, red vinyl booths cracked with age, chrome edges dulled by years of fingerprints. A half-decorated plastic Christmas tree leaned slightly near the counter, one strand of lights refusing to work. Holiday music played softly from an old speaker in the corner, the volume so low it felt apologetic. Behind the counter moved Naomi, her apron tied a little too tight around her waist, shoulders stiff from a double shift that never seemed to end. She was young, but exhaustion had a way of stealing years from a person's face. Her hair was pulled back neatly, not for style, but practicality. Every movement she made was efficient: refill, wipe, carry, smile, like she couldn't afford to waste a single ounce of energy. Her feet ached, her back burned, and her mind never stopped counting: rent, medicine, electric. She moved between tables with practiced kindness, topping off coffee cups before anyone asked, sliding plates down gently, offering smiles that cost her more than most people realized. The tips tonight were thin. Holiday crowds came with holiday stinginess. People were saving for gifts, not generosity. At the register stood the manager, Rick, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the clock above the grill. His jaw was tight, irritation radiating off him like heat. 5 minutes, he snapped to no one in particular. "We're closing." Naomi nodded quietly and kept working. That's when the door opened. Cold rushed in first, then silence. An elderly couple stepped inside, snow clinging to their coats. The man's hat was worn thin, the woman's gloves frayed at the fingertips. They hesitated just inside the doorway, looking around as if they weren't sure they were welcome. The woman clutched her purse close to her chest, eyes flicking to the menu board, then quickly away. Rick saw them immediately. "We're closing." He barked before they could even speak. The old man lifted his hands slightly, voice gentle. "We just wanted something warm. Soup, maybe." Rick scoffed. "This isn't a shelter." Naomi froze mid-step, a tray balanced on one hand. The woman spoke softly. "We can share. We don't need much." Rick shook his head, already reaching for the door. "You can't afford this place. I'm not running a charity." The words hit the room like a dropped plate. A couple in the corner booth stared into their mugs. A man at the counter suddenly found his phone very interesting. No one said a word. The elderly couple stood there, shoulders sinking, humiliation settling over them heavier than the snow outside. The woman nodded, eyes glossy, and turned toward the door. That's when Naomi moved. "Wait." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. Rick spun around. "Naomi, what are you doing?" She looked at the couple, then at the counter where a small jar sat. Her jar. A few crumpled bills and coins inside. Everything she'd managed to save over weeks. Money she needed. Money she'd been guarding like oxygen. Her throat tightened. She thought of the envelope at home, the unpaid bill. The reason she'd been skipping meals. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the jar. Rick's eyes widened. "Don't even think about it." She stepped past him, walking toward the couple. "You can have it," she said, voice shaking just enough to be real. "I'll pay for that." The old woman gasped softly. The man stared at her like he hadn't heard right. Rick exploded. "Are you serious right now? This is coming out of your—" Naomi cut him off without raising her voice. "I know." She gently guided the couple toward a booth near the window, pulling out the chair for the woman first. "Sit," she said softly. "Please." They sat, stunned, hands folded in their laps, unsure what to do with kindness they hadn't asked for. Naomi turned away quickly before anyone could see her face. She ducked into the back for a moment, pressing her hand to her mouth as tears spilled over. Silent, controlled, practiced. Then she wiped her cheeks, straightened her apron, and walked back out. Snow continued to fall outside. The couple sat at the table, hands wrapped around steaming bowls, still in shock. And Naomi kept working, as if nothing had happened even though everything had. Night bled into early morning the way it always did for Naomi, quietly, without ceremony. By the time her shift ended, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. Rick barely looked at her when she clocked out. He didn't need to say anything. His silence carried the message just fine. She stepped outside into the cold, pulling her jacket tight. Snow still dusted the sidewalks, but the storm had softened into something calmer, almost peaceful. The town looked different at this hour, honest, exposed, like it didn't have the energy left to pretend. Naomi walked home. Her apartment sat above a closed-down laundromat, the sign still hanging crooked like a bad promise. The stairs creaked as she climbed them, every step echoing her exhaustion. Inside, the space was small but clean. A single couch with a blanket folded neatly over the arm. A table with one chair pushed in, and on the counter mail. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Bills stacked together like they'd been planning something. Red print, final notices. She lined them up carefully, as if being neat might make them hurt less. At the edge of the table sat a brown paper bag from the pharmacy. Inside were prescription bottles, one already half empty. She leaned against the counter, closed her eyes, and breathed. In the back room, a soft cough broke the silence. "I'm awake," her mother called weakly. Naomi moved instantly. The bedroom was dim, a single lamp casting warm light over the worn quilt. Her mother lay propped against pillows, thinner than she should have been, eyes tired but gentle. "You should be sleeping," Naomi said softly, checking the oxygen tube, smoothing the blanket. Her mother smiled faintly. "You worked late again," Naomi shrugged. "Holiday rush." Her mother studied her face, the way mothers always did. "You ate," Naomi hesitated just long enough to be caught, then smiled. "At work." Her mother didn't argue. She never did. She just reached out and squeezed Naomi's hand. "You're a good girl," she said. "Always have been." Naomi swallowed hard. She remembered being little, standing on a chair in their old kitchen, stirring soup while her mother rested at the table. Remembered her mother teaching her how to split one sandwich into 2 meals, how to smile even when your stomach growled, how dignity wasn't something anyone could take unless you handed it over. Never let hunger make you cruel, her mother used to say, and never let comfort make you blind. That was the house Naomi grew up in. Not rich, not easy, but kind. She tucked her mother in, turned off the lamp, and went back into the main room. She opened the fridge, milk, eggs, leftovers wrapped carefully in foil, enough for tomorrow, maybe the next day if she stretched it. She sat at the table and finally looked at the empty spot where her savings jar used to be. Gone. Her chest tightened. She could still see the couple's faces, the way the woman's hands shook, the way the man tried to stand tall even while being dismissed like he didn't matter. Naomi rested her elbows on the table and pressed her forehead into her hands. She hadn't done it for praise. She hadn't done it to be brave. She did it because she knew exactly what it felt like to be counted out. The next afternoon, she was back at the diner. Same apron, same tired feet, same flickering neon. She moved through her shift like always, refilling water glasses before customers asked, checking on the man who came in every Tuesday alone, making sure the kids at booth 4 got extra napkins and crayons no one noticed, no one ever did. Rick barked orders, complained about waste, snapped at a customer who asked for more coffee without paying for a refill. Naomi absorbed it all without comment, the way she always had, because kindness wasn't something she turned on for attention. It was who she was when no one was watching. She wiped down the counter near the door, glancing briefly at the booth where the elderly couple had sat the night before. It was empty now, clean, like nothing had happened, but something had, and Naomi felt it not as pride, not as regret, but as a quiet certainty deep in her chest. Some people were generous because they had plenty. Others were generous because they remembered having nothing. Naomi picked up her tray and went back to work, unaware that the smallest choice she'd made on the coldest night of the year had just set something far bigger in motion. The couple didn't rush their meal. Naomi noticed that almost immediately. Most people who came in hungry ate fast, eyes down, like they were afraid the food might disappear if they didn't claim it quickly. But these two moved differently. The woman lifted her spoon slowly, letting the steam rise first. The man paused between bites, setting the spoon down neatly every time, as if eating itself was something to be respected. Naomi passed their table twice before she realized they were barely speaking. Not because they were uncomfortable, because they didn't need to. When they did talk, it was low and gentle. The man leaned slightly toward the woman, murmuring something that made her smile faintly. She nodded once, eyes soft, then glanced around the diner, not casually, observantly. Naomi felt a strange prickle in her chest and forced herself to focus on work. She refilled a coffee cup at the counter, wiped down a booth, rang up an order. Still, her eyes kept drifting back to that corner. She noticed small things, how the man watched Rick behind the counter. Not angry, not judgmental, just measuring. How the woman noticed the customers who sat alone. How they both looked up every time Naomi passed, not to demand anything, just to acknowledge her presence. Most customers didn't do that. At one point, the man gently adjusted the napkin holder, so it sat straight on the table. Another time, the woman pushed her chair in slightly, so Naomi wouldn't bump it while walking past. It felt intentional. Naomi shook the thought away. She didn't want to read into it. People were just people. Kindness didn't need meaning beyond itself. Still, something about them lingered. When Rick snapped at a younger waitress for spilling a drink, Naomi noticed the woman's expression tighten. When a customer scoffed at the price of pie and muttered under his breath, the man's jaw set briefly before relaxing again. They were watching. When the bowls were empty, The woman dabbed her mouth carefully and folded her napkin. The man placed his spoon inside the bowl, centered, almost ceremonial. Naomi approached to clear the table. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "It was very warm." "You're welcome," Naomi replied automatically. The man hesitated, then said, "Not just the food." Naomi met his eyes. There was no pity there, no superiority, just something steady. She nodded once, unsure what to say, and reached for the bowls. As they stood to leave, Rick finally glanced their way. Clearly irritated, they'd stayed until the very end of the shift. He didn't say anything, but his silence was sharp, dismissive. The man didn't look at him. Instead, he turned back to Naomi one last time. "Be well," he said simply. The woman smiled, eyes shining just a little, then followed him toward the door. Cold rushed in again as it opened. Snow swirled briefly around their legs, then they were gone. Naomi stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding the empty bowls. The diner felt different somehow. Quieter, heavier. Rick snapped his fingers. "Clock out." She did. That night, sleep came slowly. Naomi lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the heater and her mother's breathing through the thin wall. Her thoughts kept circling back to the same image, the woman's careful smile, the man's steady gaze. She told herself it didn't matter. The next morning, the knock came early. Naomi startled awake, heart racing, then glanced at the clock. Too early for deliveries. Too early for anything good or bad. She pulled on a sweater and opened the door cautiously. A delivery driver stood there, clipboard tucked under his arm, holding a neatly wrapped basket. "Naomi Carter?" he asked. "Yes, got something for you." She frowned. "I think there's a mistake." He double-checked the label. "Address matches." She took the basket slowly, thanked him, and closed the door. Inside, she set it down on the table and stared at it like it might disappear. The basket was modest but thoughtful. Tea, honey, crackers, fresh fruit. A small box of chocolates not fancy, but chosen with care. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a folded note. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for choosing kindness, no name, no explanation." Naomi sat down hard in the chair. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She pressed her lips together, blinking fast. It wasn't the basket. It wasn't the things inside. It was the note. "Thank you for seeing us." She hadn't thought of it that way. To her, they hadn't been invisible. They'd just been people who needed something warm on a cold night. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. At the diner later that day, she went about her shift like always. Same rhythm, same polite smiles, same exhaustion. Someone send you flowers or something. A coworker joked when Naomi mentioned the basket in passing. She shrugged, just a thank you. Rick overheard and scoffed. "See, now people expect handouts." Naomi didn't respond. She wiped down tables, refilled glasses, helped an older man read the menu without making him feel small. She didn't think about the couple anymore, not really. She assumed that was the end of it. She didn't know they had been watching her long before she noticed them. Didn't know they had noticed how she moved before being asked, how she spoke without judgment, how she never once looked toward the door to see who was watching. She didn't know the basque. It was only a gesture, not a conclusion. And she didn't know that somewhere beyond the diner's worn walls, a quiet decision had already been made. All she knew was this: she had done what felt right. And sometimes the smallest moments, ones that pass without applause, without recognition, are the ones that linger longest. Somewhere, a question waited patiently for its answer. Why had they really noticed her? 2 days later, The diner was loud again, not the quiet, hollow kind of loud that came with late nights and tired customers, but the sharp, overlapping noise of a lunch rush. Plates clattered, coffee machines hissed, voices piled over one another in impatient bursts. Snow had melted into slush outside, and people poured in hungry, cold, and irritated. Naomi moved fast. She weaved between booths, balancing trays, calling out orders, dodging elbows and chairs like muscle memory guided her more than thought. Her hair was pulled back tighter than usual. Her eyes looked tired but focused. Whatever softness she'd felt over the past few days, she'd tucked it away where work couldn't touch it. Rick hovered near the register, unusually alert. Busy hours made him nervous. Money was on the line, and Rick trusted nothing that couldn't be counted. Table 7's been waiting. He snapped. I know. Naomi said calmly, already turning. The door opened again. A man stepped in first, welled, dressed, clean cut, a long dark coat dusted lightly with melting snow. His posture straight, unhurried. He paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room with calm certainty. Then the woman followed, elegant, composed. Her coat was tailored, her scarf expensive but understated. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need volume to be noticed. For a split second, Naomi didn't recognize them. Then her breath caught. It was the same couple. The room didn't react immediately. No one ever does at first. But something shifted. Conversations dipped. A few heads turned. There was a gravity to the way they moved, the way they stood together without hesitation, like they belonged exactly where they were. Rick straightened instantly. His voice changed before his face did. Good afternoon, he said, overly polite. Welcome in. Naomi froze mid-step, heart-thudding. They looked different, not just cleaner, not just warmer. Different. The man removed his gloves slowly, placing them neatly into his coat pocket. The woman smiled faintly at Rick, though her eyes didn't linger on him. We're looking for the young woman who paid for our meal, the man said. The words sliced clean through the room. Rick blinked. Excuse me, the waitress. The woman added gently, we'd like to thank her properly. Rick's gaze snapped toward Naomi like he'd just remembered she existed. Naomi felt heat rush to her face. Oh, Rick said quickly, forcing a laugh. That was her. He gestured toward Naomi. But there's no need to. The man raised a hand slightly. We insist. Naomi stepped forward, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Yes, she asked, already bracing herself. Her mind raced. Had she broken a rule? Had Rick complained? Was this about the money? I'm sorry. She added instinctively, if I did something wrong. The woman shook her head. You didn't. Rick forced a smile so tight it looked painful. Why don't you take a seat? Best booth we have. He gestured toward the corner by the window, the one usually reserved for regulars and people who tipped well. Naomi's stomach twisted. The couple didn't look at her as they walked past. They moved with purpose, unhurried, their presence commanding space without demanding it. They sat. Rick waved Naomi over sharply. Go on. She approached the table, heart pounding, suddenly very aware of every eye in the diner. Yes, sir, she said quietly. The man looked up at her. Up close, his eyes were sharp but kind, assessing, not judging. We wanted to see you again, he said. Naomi nodded awkwardly. I'm glad you're doing okay. The woman smiled. We are. Rick lingered nearby, pretending to check menus. The man glanced at him, then back at Naomi. Would you sit with us? Naomi blinked. I'm working. Rick cut in fast. She can take a break. Naomi stared at him, stunned. Slowly, She slid into the seat across from them, her back straight, hands folded in her lap like she'd been called into a principal's office. The room buzzed with whispers now. That them, they look rich. Why's Naomi sitting down? Naomi swallowed. If this is about the other night, the woman leaned forward slightly. We came back because something's been bothering us. Naomi's chest tightened. The man continued, his voice calm, measured, the way things felt when we left. Naomi didn't know what to say. Rick cleared his throat. Look, if there's an issue. The man's eyes flicked to him, polite but firm. There isn't, for you. Rick's smile faltered. The woman's gaze returned to Naomi. We were hoping you'd tell us something. Naomi frowned slightly. Tell you what? Why you did it? The man said. Naomi's breath caught. She looked down at her hands. I don't know. You were cold. You were hungry. That's not an answer. The woman said gently. That's a fact. Naomi looked up, confused. The man leaned back in his seat, studying her carefully. People don't usually give away what they need most. Naomi's cheeks burned. I didn't think about it. The woman exchanged a glance with the man. Something passed between them, silent, meaningful. Around them, the diner had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the grill seemed to hiss less. The man smiled faintly. That's what doesn't make sense. Naomi's heart hammered. Nothing about this felt like a simple thank you anymore. Everything about them felt different. He folded his hands on the table and said softly, deliberately, We think it's time we explained who we are. Naomi inhaled sharply, and the room held its breath. Naomi's hands were still folded in her lap, but her fingers had gone cold. The whole diner felt like it had tilted, like the air had shifted around that booth, and everyone in the room knew something important was about to happen, even if they couldn't explain why. Rick hovered nearby, with a fake smile plastered on his face, trying to look helpful, trying to look like he belonged in the moment. He'd never looked this nervous when Naomi was getting yelled at for dropping a fork. Now his eyes flicked from the couple to Naomi to the staring customers like he was calculating the safest exit. The man leaned forward first, calm as ever. His voice stayed low, but it carried. My name is Adrian, he said. And this is my wife, Margaret. Naomi blinked, unsure what those names were supposed to mean to her. They sounded normal, ordinary, like names you'd see on a mailbox. Margaret's eyes stayed on Naomi, gentle but steady. We owe you an explanation, she said softly, not because you asked for anything, but because you deserve to understand what happened here. Naomi swallowed, throat tight. I don't need anything, I just... Adrian lifted a hand slightly, not stopping her, but guiding the moment. We know. He glanced around the diner, taking it in, not with judgment, not with disgust, but with a kind of quiet awareness that made the room feel exposed. Like the walls had turned transparent. We traveled during the holidays. Adrian continued. Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's. We go places where no one expects us. A few heads in the diner leaned in. Forks paused midair. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Margaret added, We dress down. We keep it simple. We try to blend. Naomi's heartbeat kicked up again. Why? Adrian's eyes flicked briefly to Rick, then back to Naomi. Because when people think no, one important is watching, they show you who they really are. A quiet murmur rolled through the diner. Rick chuckled nervously. Hey now, I treat everyone the same. Adrian's gaze turned to him fully for the first time. Not angry, not loud, just sharp enough to make Rick's smile slip. We're not here to argue with you, Adrian said evenly. We're here to speak the truth of what we witnessed. Rick's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt again. Naomi felt heat rising in her face, a mix of embarrassment and dread. "Please, I don't want trouble." Margaret's voice softened. "Sweetheart, trouble found you. You didn't chase it." Naomi's eyes flickered, and she looked down quickly. That word, sweetheart, hit her harder than it should have. Not because it was special, but because it was kind, and kindness still caught her off guard when it wasn't coming from her. Adrian rested his hands on the table. 2 nights ago, we walked into this diner cold and hungry. That's all anyone needed to know. The diner was silent now. Even the kitchen sounds seemed distant. We didn't ask for free food. He continued. We didn't ask for sympathy. We asked for soup. Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly. And we were met with cruelty. Rick's face flushed. I wasn't cruel. I was closing. It's policy. Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You told us we couldn't afford this place. Rick's mouth opened, closed. He tried again. Look, I just meant, and you called this place not a shelter. Margaret added, calm but cutting. Rick's eyes darted to the customers, searching for allies. Some looked away. Others stared at him like they were seeing him clearly for the first time. Naomi's stomach turned. She hated this. Not because Rick didn't deserve it, he did, but because she didn't like being the reason anyone got exposed. She'd learned long ago that staying quiet kept you safer, but Adrian kept speaking, voice steady, and then we watched this room. He said, sweeping his gaze across the diners. We watched people listen. We watched people see 2 elderly folks being pushed out into the snow. A woman near the window shifted uncomfortably. A man at the counter cleared his throat and stared into his coffee. No one said a word. Adrian continued. No one stood up. No one intervened. The shame in the diner thickened like fog. Margaret leaned closer, voice soft but firm. Not until her. She nodded toward Naomi. Naomi's throat tightened so hard she almost couldn't breathe. Adrian turned fully toward Naomi now, the spotlight narrowing to just the 2 of them. We saw you hesitate. He said, We saw you look at us like you wanted to help but didn't know if you could. Naomi whispered, I didn't. Yes, you did. Margaret said gently. You fought yourself first. Naomi's eyes burned. She blinked fast, forcing the tears down. She wasn't going to cry in front of all these people. Not again, not here, Adrian continued, and then you did something we rarely see anymore. He paused, long enough that the silence felt like pressure against Naomi's chest. You called us back, he said, not for show, not to prove anything. You called us back because you couldn't watch us leave like that. Naomi's fingers tightened together in her lap. Adrian's voice dropped, intimate now. And you said it. The words we haven't stopped thinking about. Naomi felt her cheeks burn. Adrian repeated it anyway, clear as day. You can have it. I'll pay for that. A ripple moved through the diner like a wave. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else whispered, Damn. Rick looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Margaret nodded slowly. You didn't just pay for food. You paid for dignity. Naomi finally looked up, eyes glossy despite her effort. It was just dinner. Adrian's expression softened. No, it wasn't. He leaned back, letting the moment breathe. Then he said plainly, We are very wealthy. The diner shifted again, like everyone collectively leaned forward without meaning to. Rick blinked. Wait, what? Adrian continued calmly. We own several businesses across the state. We fund programs. We donate. We give. Margaret added, and we learned a long time ago, money can protect you from being cold, but it can't protect you from being invisible. Naomi's heart thudded. Adrian's eyes didn't leave hers. So we travel anonymously during the holidays, not to judge people, not to shame them. Margaret nodded. To understand humanity. Adrian's voice stayed level, to see how people treat the vulnerable when there's nothing to gain. The words sat heavy in the air. Rick suddenly found his voice again, desperate now. Look, man, if you're some kind of influencer or something, this isn't fair. I run a business, I've got rules, you can't just... Adrian turned to him slowly. You want to talk about fairness? He asked quietly. Rick's mouth snapped shut. Adrian stood up, not aggressively, not dramatically, but the moment he rose, it felt like the room rose with him. He looked at the diners, one by one, then back at Rick. You humiliated two elderly people because you assumed they were poor, he said. And you felt safe doing it. Rick's face reddened. I didn't assume, you did. Margaret said, still seated, her tone calm enough to sting. And so did everyone who watched. Naomi's chest squeezed painfully. She wanted to disappear. Adrian's voice softened slightly. This isn't about destroying anyone. Rick's eyes narrowed. Then what is it about? Adrian glanced at Naomi. It's about character. He took a breath, then spoke clearly, like he wanted every word to land exactly where it needed to. Money didn't impress us. The diner held its breath. Adrian looked at Naomi and finished the line. You did. Naomi's composure cracked. Her eyes watered instantly, hot tears rising before she could stop them. She looked down quickly, wiping her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. She hated crying in public. But this wasn't the same kind of crying she'd done in her apartment, staring at bills and praying the power didn't get shut off. This was something else. This was being seen. Margaret stood now too, stepping closer to Naomi's side of the booth, lowering her voice so it felt like a private moment even in a packed diner. We're not here to make you feel like you owe us, she said. We're here because you reminded us something still exists in this world. Naomi shook her head weakly. I didn't do it for, we know, Adrian said gently. That's why it mattered. Rick tried again, voice strained. So what, you're gonna blast us online, ruin my business. Adrian's expression stayed calm. We don't need to blast anything. Margaret's voice was soft but final. Truth doesn't need volume to do damage. It just needs daylight. Rick swallowed hard. The room was so quiet, now you could hear the coffee machine clicking. Adrian turned slightly, addressing the room again. We're not asking anyone to clap. He said, we're not asking anyone to pretend you would have done the same. He looked at the faces, some guilty, some stunned, some quietly moved. We're asking you to remember that your silence is also a choice. Naomi's shoulders trembled, but she kept her head up. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded card. Simple, clean, elegant. He placed it gently on the table in front of Naomi. If you're willing, he said softly, we'd like to speak with you after your shift. Naomi stared at the card like it was glowing. Margaret touched Naomi's hand lightly, brief, respectful. Thank you, she whispered again, eyes shining. Then the two of them turned their attention to their table, like they had every right to be there, because they did. Rick stood frozen, his face tight with panic and anger and embarrassment all at once. The diner slowly returned to movement, chairs scraping, orders resuming. But the atmosphere had changed. People weren't just eating anymore. They were thinking. Naomi looked down at the card again, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know what they wanted. But she knew something deep in her bones. That one moment, her last saved money, sliding across the counter, was no longer just a private sacrifice. It had become a mirror, and the whole room had been forced to look. The diner didn't explode into applause. That surprised Naomi. Instead, something quieter happened, something heavier. Conversations resumed slowly, like people weren't sure what tone was appropriate anymore. Forks scraped plates again, but the sound felt different now. Less careless, more aware, Rick stood behind the counter, arms stiff at his sides, his authority evaporating by the second. He tried to look busy, tried to look unbothered, but his eyes kept drifting toward Adrian and Margaret like he was bracing for impact. Adrian didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, he didn't perform, he simply stood there calm, composed, and that somehow felt worse. "I want to be clear," Adrian said, his voice steady but firm enough to carry across the room. "What happens next isn't about punishment. It's about consequences." Rick scoffed weakly. "Consequences? For what? Running my diner?" "For how you run it," Margaret replied evenly. She turned her attention fully to Rick now. Her tone wasn't angry. It was measured, disappointed in a way that stripped defenses instead of triggering them. "You don't just sell food," she continued. "You decide who deserves to feel human inside your walls." Rick swallowed. "I treat paying customers," Adrian cut in, not sharply, but decisively. "You decide who you think will pay. That's different." Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders sagged slightly, like the fight was draining out of him. Adrian reached into his coat pocket again, this time pulling out his phone. He didn't wave it around, didn't record, didn't threaten exposure. "I've already made a few calls," he said calmly. "Nothing dramatic, just clarifying where my business stands." Rick stiffened. "What business?" Margaret answered. "Everyone we have with you." The words landed hard. Rick's face drained of color. You're kidding." Adrian shook his head. "We don't partner with places that mistake cruelty for policy." Rick laughed nervously. "You can't just pull." "We can," Margaret said simply. "And we are." She didn't smile. Rick's gaze flicked around the diner, suddenly aware of every customer watching him. A man he'd known for years, a family who came every Sunday, the waitress he'd barked at countless times. The power had shifted, and he felt it. Adrian continued, voice level. "We will also be filing a formal complaint regarding discriminatory practices." Rick snapped. "Discriminatory? That's a stretch." Margaret met his eyes without blinking. "You removed elderly patrons based on assumed income." Rick's jaw clenched. He said nothing. Adrian nodded once, as if that silence was answer enough. "This doesn't require a scene," Adrian said. "No shouting, no threats, just accountability." Rick looked smaller now, not destroyed, not humiliated publicly. Just exposed. Naomi watched it all in stunned quiet. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel revenge. She felt relief. The kind that comes when someone finally says the thing you've been swallowing for years. Then Adrian turned back to her. The shift in his posture was immediate, softer, warmer. "This part," he said gently, "is about you." Naomi's breath caught. "I didn't do this for," she started. "We know," Margaret said quickly, "and we won't insult you by calling this charity." Naomi frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" Margaret smiled, a real one this time. "Respect." Adrian pulled a second envelope from his coat pocket and slid it across the table toward Naomi. She stared at it, afraid to touch it. "You don't have to open it now," Adrian said, "but I want you to understand what it represents." Naomi hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside were documents, clean, official, numbers she wasn't used to seeing attached to her name. Her hands began to shake. Adrian spoke carefully, giving her space to process. "We asked questions, quiet ones." Naomi's chest tightened. "About me, Yes, Margaret said, only what mattered. Naomi's eyes filled as she scanned the page. This is my mother's treatment. Adrian nodded, fully covered. Her breath left her in a rush. She gripped the edge of the booth, overwhelmed. And this, Margaret continued gently, pointing to another page, is housing support, something stable, somewhere you don't have to worry every month if kindness will cost you safety. Naomi shook her head, tears spilling freely now. I can't. Adrian held up a hand. We're not asking you to accept this out of gratitude. Margaret leaned closer. We're offering it because the world should not punish people like you for being decent. Naomi covered her mouth, sobbing silently. She hadn't cried like this in years, not openly, not in front of anyone. This wasn't desperation. It was release. The kind that comes when fear finally loosens its grip. There's more. Adrian added softly, education, if you want it, options, time. Naomi laughed weakly through tears. I don't even know what I want anymore. That's okay, Margaret said. Safety gives you space to find out. Rick stood rigid behind the counter, watching the moment slip entirely beyond his control. One of the cooks peeked out from the kitchen, eyes wide. A customer wiped their eyes quietly. Someone near the window whispered, "She deserves it." Naomi felt like she might float away if she didn't hold onto something solid. She looked up at Adrian, eyes red. Why me? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, because kindness should meet safety sometimes. Otherwise, we teach good people to stop being good. Margaret reached out and squeezed Naomi's hand. We're not saving you. She said, you were already standing. We're just making sure the ground under you doesn't collapse. Naomi nodded, overwhelmed beyond words. Rick cleared his throat weakly. So that's it. Adrian glanced at him briefly. For us, Margaret added, what happens next is up to you. Rick looked around the diner again. At Naomi. At the customers. At the staff who no longer looked afraid of him. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. Naomi folded the documents carefully, her hands still trembling. She pressed them to her chest, not like money, but like proof. Proof that her kindness hadn't been foolish. Proof that sacrifice didn't always end in loss. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her bones. Safety. The diner didn't change overnight. That's not how real places change, not how real people change. But the very next morning, something was different the moment Naomi stepped through the door. The air felt less sharp. The kitchen was still loud. The coffee still tasted like it had been reheated 3 times, and the neon sign still flickered like it was ready to quit. But the staff weren't flinching as much. They weren't glancing over their shoulders every time someone raised their voice. Rick wasn't barking, not because he'd suddenly found kindness in his heart, because fear had finally shifted sides. He stood near the register with a stiff posture and forced politeness, like a man trying on a new skin that didn't fit. He nodded at Naomi when she passed, eyes a little too wide, like he wanted to make sure she remembered he could behave now. Naomi didn't gloat. She didn't even enjoy it. If anything, she felt strange, like someone had removed a weight from her shoulders and she wasn't sure how to walk without it. In the back, Sophie, the coworker who used to roll her eyes at anyone poor, was quieter, not magically kinder, but less bold. Less loud. Like she'd realized cruelty wasn't always safe when someone with power decided to pay attention. Customers noticed, too. People who used to look away when someone struggled now glanced up faster. A man who had been silent the night Naomi paid for the couple's meal tipped twice as much that week. Another customer who'd once mocked an older woman for counting coins quietly covered her bill without a word. Small shifts, not perfect, not dramatic, but real, Naomi kept doing what she always did. She refilled water before anyone asked. She smiled at the lonely man who came in every Tuesday and sat at the same booth. She slipped extra bread to a mother with 2 kids when she noticed the woman barely touched her own plate. But there was one difference now. Naomi wasn't doing it with that constant, gnawing fear in her stomach. Because after her shift, she went home not to panic over late notices and empty jars, but to a letter that sat on her counter like a quiet miracle. She still hadn't gotten used to it. She opened it again and again, like she was checking it was real. Utility assistance, medical support, a plan that didn't rely on her breaking her body every day. She didn't feel rich. She felt able to breathe. The first thing she did was sit with her mother that night, holding her hand while her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I was so worried," her mother whispered. "I hated watching you carry all of it." Naomi swallowed hard. "I didn't want you scared." Her mother squeezed her fingers weakly. "Baby, you're allowed to be helped too." Those words hit Naomi harder than any check ever could. Because Naomi had spent her whole life believing help was something you gave, not something you deserved. A week later, Adrian and Margaret came back, not as a spectacle, not as a scene, but quietly. No cameras. No crowd, just the 2 of them sitting in the same booth, calm and steady, like they weren't above the place, like they didn't need to prove anything. Naomi approached cautiously, her heart still racing the way it had the first time. Margaret smiled warmly. "How's your mother?" Naomi's voice caught. "Better. She's finally resting." Adrian nodded slowly, like that mattered to him the way it should. "Good." Naomi hesitated. "I still don't know how to thank you." Margaret shook her head gently. "We didn't do this so you'd thank us." Adrian added, "We did it because the world is loud with cruelty. We wanted to be louder with respect." Naomi sat with them for a few minutes after her shift, and for the first time, she asked questions she'd never dared to ask anyone with money. "Why do you do this?" she asked. Margaret's gaze softened. "Because once, when I was young, I watched my father humiliate a waitress for dropping a tray. She cried in the kitchen and still came back out smiling." Adrian's voice was quiet. "We've spent a lifetime around wealth. It makes people think they're important. But the older we get, the more we realize the real strength lies in people who keep showing up with nothing." Naomi stared at them, trying to process that they weren't there to play hero. They were there because something inside them had been changed too. And Naomi realized the ripple wasn't just about her. It was about what her kindness had forced other people to confront in themselves. The diner's ownership changed faster than Naomi expected. Not public, not dramatic. One day, Rick walked in looking pale and furious, and by the end of that week, he was gone. No big announcement, no shouting in the dining room, no viral video, just an empty office and a new manager. The new manager, a woman named Dana, didn't come in talking about profits first. She walked through the diner, looked every server in the eye, and said one simple thing: "We're going to run this place like people matter." Sophie scoffed quietly at first, but the tone of the room didn't support her the way it used to. Little by little, the staff started to stand straighter. They laughed more, they moved like they weren't constantly bracing for impact. Naomi noticed something else too. Customers changed, not all, not magically, but enough that it mattered. People started holding doors for strangers, leaving bigger tips, speaking up when someone got embarrassed. Not because Adrian and Margaret were watching, because they'd finally realized they were watching themselves. Naomi's life changed outside the diner too. She didn't quit working. That wasn't who she was. But she cut her hours down just enough to sleep. Just enough to visit her mother without rushing. Just enough to feel like life wasn't a constant emergency. She enrolled in night classes, the kind she'd always told herself were for other people. She bought a second-hand laptop and stared at it for an hour the first time, overwhelmed by the idea of having options. She still wore her diner apron, still came in tired some days, but the fear behind her eyes was fading. And when it faded, something else started to take its place. Confidence, not loud, not cocky, just steady. Adrian and Margaret kept doing what they'd always done. They traveled quietly, they observed, they helped where help was deserved. And they didn't make it about themselves, but they stayed in touch with Naomi, not like a charity case, not like a project, like family. Margaret sent Naomi small notes sometimes, encouragement, not advice. Adrian checked in about her classes, her mother, her dreams, and Naomi, who had spent years taking care of everyone else, slowly learned how to accept love without feeling guilty. One snowy evening, a month after Christmas, Naomi left the diner and noticed a young man outside holding the door for an elderly woman. He smiled at Naomi as she passed, then offered to carry the woman's bag to her car. Naomi paused, watching it. It wasn't huge, it wasn't world-changing, but it was a ripple. She looked up at the diner's neon sign, still flickering, still imperfect. And she smiled softly, because she finally understood something she hadn't known on Christmas Eve. One act of kindness didn't just feed two people. It rewrote a room, it shifted a community, it reminded strangers they still had hearts. And Naomi, still humble, still tired, still kind, walked back inside for her shift, with a new feeling in her chest. Not fear, hope. Night settled over the town gently now, the kind of quiet that felt earned instead of empty. Snow lined the sidewalks in soft, uneven ridges, reflecting the glow of streetlights and storefront windows. The diner's neon sign flickered, as always, stubborn and imperfect, casting red and blue light across the pavement. Naomi tied her apron, smoothing it down the same way she always did. Some things hadn't changed. She still worked the late shift, still wiped down counters until her hands smelled like soap and coffee, still greeted people with the same warmth she always had. But the fear that used to sit in her chest tight, constant, exhausting, was gone. She moved through the diner calmly, confidently, like someone who knew she belonged in her own life. When she poured coffee for an older man sitting alone near the window, she didn't rush away. She asked how his night was. When a tired couple came in with a restless child, she brought crayons without being asked. When a woman counted coins quietly at the register, Naomi waited without judgment, offering a smile instead of impatience. No one clapped, no one filmed, and that was exactly how Naomi liked it. During a lull, she leaned against the counter and let her thoughts wander. She thought about that cold Christmas Eve, the way the snow had looked endless, the way the couple had stood near the door trying not to be seen. She remembered the moment she'd reached for her savings, the knot in her stomach, the fear she'd felt walking back to the kitchen, with tears burning her eyes. She hadn't known then what would come of it. She hadn't helped them because she believed in miracles. She'd helped them because hunger felt familiar, because dignity mattered. Naomi had learned that lesson young, watching her mother navigate sickness and scarcity with grace. She'd learned it from nights when the fridge was almost empty, but kindness still found a way to the table. She'd learned it from being overlooked, underestimated, and still choosing to be gentle anyway. Across the diner, the new manager laughed with a cook over a harmless mistake. The sound still surprised Naomi sometimes. It reminded her how fragile environments were, how quickly cruelty could become normal if no one questioned it, and how quickly it could fade when someone did. After her shift, Naomi stepped outside. The cold air kissed her cheeks, sharp but clean. She stood there for a moment, breathing it in, looking up at the dark sky dusted with stars. She thought about Adrian and Margaret, how they'd come and gone without demanding recognition, how they'd treated her not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a person. They hadn't framed what they did as rescue. They'd framed it as respect. That had mattered, because Naomi didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be safe. She pulled her coat tighter and walked home, keys jingling softly in her pocket. The apartment door opened to warmth and light. Her mother slept peacefully in the back room now, breathing steady, healing not just from medicine, but from relief. Naomi set her bag down and sat at the small table. The bills were gone, not replaced by luxury, not erased by excess, but quieted enough that they no longer screamed. She poured herself tea and sat there for a while, letting the silence settle. Kindness hadn't made her rich. It had made her free. Days passed, weeks, winter softened into something manageable. Naomi kept working, kept studying, kept caring. She didn't become flashy. She didn't tell her story unless someone asked. And even then, she spoke about it simply. I just did what felt right, she'd say, and that was true. One evening, close to closing time, the door opened and a young woman stepped inside, shivering. She looked unsure, scanning the room the way people do when they're bracing for rejection. Naomi met her eyes and smiled. "Come on in," she said warmly. "You look like you could use something hot." The woman hesitated, then nodded and sat. Naomi brought her soup. No announcement, no drama, just food, just warmth, just humanity. As she walked back to the counter, Naomi felt something settle in her chest. Not pride, not expectation, but peace. She hadn't helped that couple for reward. She hadn't helped because she believed someone powerful was watching. She hadn't helped because it would change her life. She'd helped because it was right. The holidays had a way of revealing people, stripping away distractions, showing who reached out and who looked away, showing who protected their comfort and who risked it for someone else. Naomi wiped down the counter one last time and turned off the lights behind the register. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and steady, covering old footprints and making space for new ones. She locked the door, stepped into the night, and smiled softly to herself. She didn't know they were testing her. She just knew someone was hungry,